Hey all, it's Jason from Game-Rave.com, otherwise known as Danger Boy, and this is Game-Rave TV. So, during the PlayStation and Sega Saturn era, the US gamer got screwed. Not as badly as we could have been, but we did miss out on a lot of cool things. Just ask Konami with the whole Guitar Freaks situation. Guitar Hero did it first, my ass. But one of the things that always bothered me the most was how we got screwed out of the Sega Saturn RAM cartridge. Now, for those of you that don't know, a Sega Saturn actually had two input areas. It had the CD, for the games, and then a cartridge slot in the back. In America, we basically just used it for a Game Shark and a memory card for storage. But in Japan, SNK devised one of the most beautiful hybrid situations ever. Let me back up for a bit. Around 95, 96, fighting games, one-on-one fighting games, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, Brother vs. Sister, were all the rage. Arcades were in their final golden era of competition, people spinning tokens and so forth. And as people were clamoring for the home releases, Sony and Sega and SNK all had different problems to deal with. The PlayStation's limited RAM in the system was going to be a huge crutch for 2D games because of all the file sizes of the sprites and backgrounds and so forth. The Sega Saturn was a brilliant 2D machine, but it just didn't have a big US following. And then SNK, obviously you didn't have to worry about their home conversions because they had the Neo Geo cartridge system. It was just the Neo CD that had to be, dealt with, which was usually just loading times or some minor animation frame cuts in the later systems, or later games. But in Japan, SNK, realizing that they wouldn't be able to get a perfect port of King of Fighters 95 onto the consoles without some sort of limitation or cut and so forth, came up with this really cool thing, and it was basically a hybrid game. King of Fighters 95 in Japan on the Saturn was the game CD and a ROM cart. The ROM cart was essentially an incomplete cartridge game. It basically just had, I think, background data and some other stuff. And when the CD and the cartridge worked together, the game could access more items at once and reduce loading times and so forth. Besides, obviously, more data being stored on both things. And this provided the Saturn with a absolutely gorgeous version of King of Fighters 95. After that sold pretty well, SNK kind of changed things up, and instead of making a dedicated ROM cartridge again, they made a blank 1 meg RAM cartridge, and essentially it was just extra RAM for the Saturn. And this allowed them to bring home even more Neo Geo games with better conversions, like Metal Slug and the Fatal Furies and Samurai Shodown 3 and 4. And while the Sega Saturn was getting all these amazing games in Japan, the PlayStation in Japan was getting some of those games as well, but they weren't as good. There were tons of animation frame cuts, there was slowdown. Samurai Shodown 3 was practically unplayable on the Japanese PlayStation. Like, literally, like, you would do a fierce slash and the game would just freeze for a good minute, not a minute, but a second or so forth. While SNK was doing that with the 1 meg RAM cartridge, Capcom kind of snuck in and started taking advantage of it with Marvel Superheroes. Side note, the American Marvel Superheroes on the Saturn actually does support the 1 meg RAM cartridge through a button combination. It's kind of cool. But anyway, so Capcom came along and was like, you know what, this is awesome. We got this whole Versus series. We're going to need a 4 meg RAM cartridge. And they made a 4 meg RAM cartridge, stuck in the cartridge slot, and brought to the Japanese Saturn absolutely beautiful, amazing, gorgeous, fast-loading, big sprites, almost no slowdown versions of X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, Vampire Savior, which to Americans is Darksiders 3, and all this other beautiful, beautiful things. And while this was all going on in Japan, fight fans like myself were basically sitting here on this side of the ocean going, come to us. And what should have been a crowning achievement in porting and bringing over and importing to the American shores, we just got raped. Basically, three things happened. One, Capcom wasn't convinced that an American would spend the $80, $90 to buy the RAM cartridge and game release of, say, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. And more on that at the end of the video. And they were really hemming and hawing about it and pretty much said, you know, hands off, like, you know, we're not going to handle it. The second problem was that the Saturn itself, despite being a 2D superior machine, just couldn't go up against the PlayStation. 3D gaming really hit its stride with the PlayStation 1, and people were so enamored with like Tekken and Gran Turismo and the better Tomb Raider that the Saturn was basically just being left in the dust, and Sega really, you know, didn't feel the need to try and help Capcom bring over the RAM cartridge, and the fact that internally the Saturn was already being planned for demise to introduce the Dreamcast and try and save everything, just so depressing. And we never got that chance to see these, you know, beautiful hybrid releases. The biggest kick in the crotch, and to this day still hurts, and like I said, I'm the biggest PlayStation fan, but son of a bitch, is this screen right here. Sony, who really didn't care for 2D at the time of the PlayStation 1 and really just hindered here and there and all this crazy other crap, as if to try and pour salt in a Saturn owner's wounds, licensed through SNK to release King of Fighters 95 and Samurai Shodown 3 in America, along with Real Bout, but more on that in a second. This hurts for two reasons. One, King of Fighters 95 on the PlayStation was a decent port. They fixed on the US side. They fixed the music. They fixed the sound issues, but the control wasn't as responsive as it could be, and the loading times absolutely sucked. Period. Done deal. With Samurai Shodown 3, as I said earlier, the import version was just absolutely broken, and in bringing it to America, they tried. They really did. They sped up the animation in the game to try and offset the whole missing frames, and they sped up the loading time and made some adjustments here and there. But it just it's terrible. In fact, you can actually check out the reviews. King of Fighters 95 was actually the first Game-Rave page ever done, and was actually the basis for the whole website. So you can check those links down below. But because the PlayStation versions were so poorly received and basically just shat upon by reviewers and so forth, that's what left Real Bout on the cutting room floor and really didn't plan for anything else to be brought over on the PlayStation. Now, that's SNK. Capcom, on the other hand, they couldn't bother to bring the RAM cartridge versions of the Saturn games over, but instead released these absolutely half-assed versions of all the Versus series, which, funny story, in Japan, X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and I think actually Darkstalkers 3 to a degree too, were called the EX editions. And basically they were called the EX editions so people would realize they weren't the true arcade version. In X-Men vs. Street Fighter on the PlayStation, you can't tag in a tag fighting game. It was a code you had to input, and then even then you had to have the same two characters flipped. So if you didn't, it was basically just one-on-one like Street Fighter. Just, so angry. But yeah, we basically got screwed, and, you know, only Sega could figure out how to sabotage the best feature of their system. But to finish up the video, remember how I said Capcom really didn't believe that people would spend the $80 to $90 for the game on the US side? At the time, I used to work for a family-owned video game store, and we did imports and, you know, US games and so forth. And when the Japanese X-Men vs. Street Fighter came out for the Japanese Saturn with the 4 meg RAM cartridge, we also had in the American X-Men vs. Street Fighter EX edition. And a customer came in and was like, "Oh yeah, how are the versions?" And I basically tore the PlayStation 1 apart and was like, "This is amazing." And the guy who didn't have a Saturn was like, "Oh, I'm sure the PlayStation version's fine, I'll take it." And he spent the $50, went home, Next day at work, not even 24 hours later, he walked back in, traded in the game used for half price because he opened and played it, and then spent $300 buying the Saturn, a second controller, X-Men vs. Street Fighter with the 4 meg Ram cartridge, and the converter cartridge. And he spent $300+ to play that $80 or $90 game. Can you imagine what the American Sega Saturn scene would have looked like if people were spending $200 just to play that one game, and Capcom brought all of them out, and SNK brought all their games? Oh, history. That's all I got for you guys this week. We'll see you next week. Take care.